On the morning of April 7, 2019, a 16-year-old named Dario Escobar waded into the main lateral ditch along the north boundary of an 80-acre lease on Brushline Road in Hidalgo County, Texas, carrying a 5-gallon bucket with 200 tilapia fingerlings swimming in it. The water came to his knees. The morning was already warm. 3 men were watching from the road embankment above. They laughed when he tilted that bucket. Every one of them. And not one of them was laughing by the time September came around. This is how that happened. Somebody had to write this one down, or it would have been forgotten. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, take a second to subscribe before we go any further. The rest of it matters. The Rio Grande Valley in early April smells like turned earth and irrigation water, and when the wind comes up from the south, the faint sweetness of early citrus bloom from the groves near the river. Hidalgo County sits at the southern tip of Texas, pressed against the Rio Grande, and it is one of the more productive agricultural counties in the state. Onions, grain sorghum, sugarcane, jalapenos, bell peppers, watermelon, a flat, irrigated patchwork of leased parcels and family ground that has been producing crops continuously since before most of the people farming it were born. Water is what makes it run. Water in Hidalgo County means the Hidalgo County Irrigation District Number 1 and its network of canals, laterals, and smaller field ditches that carry Rio Grande water out to every parcel in the county. Over 900 miles of earthen channel and concrete-lined canal, dug and extended across more than 100 years, and every mile of it has to be cleaned and watched and maintained every season. Because a ditch that fills with algae is a ditch that does not deliver water where it belongs. The ditch problem on the Brushline lateral had been building for 2 full seasons by the time Dario's family was in their 2nd year on that ground. Filamentous algae, the stringy, hair-like growth that mats up in slow-moving irrigation water, had worked in from a sluggish section downstream and spread until it covered most of the surface area of the lateral running along the north edge of the Escobar parcel. A thick pad of duckweed had layered over the algae by mid-spring each year, floating green and dense, slowing the water flow until what arrived at the field gate was a fraction of what the irrigation district was releasing at the headworks. The water assessment from the district ran to $31 per acre per year, regardless of how much water actually reached the field. You paid for the allotment whether the ditch delivered it or not. Eugenio Escobar had spent 2 spring mornings in 2018 manually raking algae from the lateral with a long-handled drag bar, which is backbreaking work that produces temporary results. The algae was back within 3 weeks. The lease on Brushline Road was held by the Escobar family, Dario's parents, Marta and Eugenio, who had farmed leased ground in the valley for 11 years. They grew grain sorghum as the primary cash crop and kept about 6 acres of jalapenos on the south end of the parcel. The lease ran to 187 per acre per year, which on 80 acres came out to 14,960 tar. And that was before seed and fertilizer and fuel and equipment rental and the water assessment. Tight operation. Most leased operations in the valley were. Gene Kutner farmed 410 acres of onions on the parcel, directly east of the Escobar ground. Gene was 61, a second-generation valley farmer who had taken the operation over from his father in 1991 and had run it the way his father had shown him, which was carefully and without much drama. He had a Massey Ferguson 8737 he ran most of the season, and a crew of 4 men he trusted completely. And he had seen every variety of spring ditch problem that Hidalgo County had to offer. He was not alarmed by the Escobar ditch specifically. He was at the road embankment on the morning of April 7th because a phone call from a neighbor the evening before had mentioned that the Escobar boy was planning to put fish in the county lateral. And in 40 years of farming, Gene Kutner had found that unusual things were generally worth watching, even when they came to nothing. Standing beside Gene was Robert Hale, the county extension agent out of the mission office, who had been contacted by the irrigation district about a possible introduction of a non-native fish species into the lateral system. Hale had 16 years with the county extension office and genuine knowledge of what happened when exotic species were introduced into South Texas waterways. He was not there to cause trouble. He was there because it was his job to know what was happening in the fields, and this was something he had not seen before. Next to Hale stood Pete Cisneros, an irrigation district field inspector, who was there for the same reason Gene Kuttner was, because this was his ditch, and he felt he ought to be present. Dario Escobar waded in and released the fingerlings. Hale said, loud enough to carry to the water, "Young man, those fish will be dead by June." Gene Kuttner did not say anything. He had not made up his mind yet. But he did not disagree. The concerns were not invented. They were reasonable. Oreochromis niloticus, the Nile tilapia, is listed as a prohibited exotic species by Texas Parks and Wildlife. It has established populations in warm Texas freshwater systems where it escaped from aquaculture operations over the years, and it competes aggressively with native species for food and habitat. Any experienced fish manager looking at tilapia in a Hidalgo County lateral in 2019 would see a liability before seeing anything else. The heat prediction had its own logic. Hidalgo County's summer temperatures run into the high 90s and sometimes past 105 degrees Fahrenheit. An unshaded earthen ditch in July looks, from a distance, like a place a tropical fish would not survive. Both concerns had a problem. Dario had looked them up. He had been looking things up since November of 2018, 4 months before he bought a single fingerling. He had a notebook to show for it. Spiral-bound, green cover, the kind you could buy at the Walmart in Edinburgh for $1.47. He had started it in early February of that year, recording ditch water temperature twice a day at fixed times, 7 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon. Every day, he checked the field. He measured water clarity at 3 separate points along the lateral. He estimated algae mat coverage and percentage of surface area, section by section, each time he went out. He counted mosquito larvae per square foot. At 4 sampling locations he had marked with stakes cut from a bundle of survey lath he found in the equipment barn. He had sketched the full ditch layout by hand and noted the 3 downstream outflow structures where he planned to install screens before a single fish entered the water. Not frantic, not rushing, just watching and writing things down, the way his grandfather had always watched and written things down before his grandfather was gone. Abundio Escobar had farmed a small parcel of dark alluvial ground in the coastal lowlands of Veracruz, Mexico for most of his working life. The soil there ran wet and warm much of the year, and the agriculture that had developed on that kind of ground over generations did not always have university names for what it was doing. It worked. That was the measure. One of the things it did involved fish. Abundio kept tilapia in the flooded margins of his milpa plots, the mixed corn and squash plantings that had been the basic food growing unit in those lowlands for longer than anyone in the family knew with certainty. Not a separate aquaculture project. Part of the field's own system, the way shade trees are part of a coffee planting. The fish kept the standing water clear of algae and mosquito larvae. Their waste moved into the soil and then into the crop. When the seasonal water was high in the early part of the growing cycle, the fish moved freely through the rows. When the water receded toward harvest, Abundio collected what fish remained and carried them to the market in Veracruz on the back of a bicycle with a wooden rack. He had done this every year from roughly 1971 until his knees and his eyesight made it impossible, around 2012. He had learned it from his own father, who had learned it the same way. Dario had followed his grandfather through those fields during the summers he spent in Veracruz as a child, 11, 12, 13 years old, watching the tilapia catch the morning light in the shallow water between corn rows. stepping carefully so as not to disturb the fish. Abundio had not called the method anything technical. He said, when Dario asked him about it, that they were letting the water work twice. Abundio Escobar died in March of 2016. Dario was 13 years old. He had been there in Veracruz the previous summer, the last summer his grandfather was strong enough to work the rows. Abundio had shown him how to read the color of the water. Clear meant the fish were healthy and feeding. Green-tinted meant the algae was outpacing the stock and you needed more fish or fewer weeds coming in from upstream. He had shown him how to walk the field margin and watch where the tilapia schooled and where they scattered, because where they scattered usually meant something was wrong with the water quality at that spot. Small knowledge, the kind you can't learn from a bulletin. He thought about the fish occasionally in the years that followed without quite knowing what to do with the memory. Then, in the fall of 2018, searching a library computer in Edinburgh, he found an agricultural extension bulletin from the University of Hawaii on integrated fish crop systems. He found 2 more from UC Davis and 1 from a Texas A&M researcher in Weslaco, who had documented a small trial on tilapia in irrigation channels in the lower valley in 2003. He read all 4 of them twice. He started his notebook in February. He's not sure exactly when the idea crossed from memory into plan. He was 16. Some things take a while. What Dario understood by April 7, 2019, that the 3 men on the embankment did not yet know was this. Oreochromis niloticus survives water temperatures up to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Its optimal range is 77 to 86 degrees, which corresponds almost exactly to the temperature of a South Texas irrigation lateral from April through September. The heat would not kill them. The warm water was the reason the method worked. A stocking of 600 fingerlings in a 200-foot lateral ditch, the density he had calculated from FAO, Integrated Fish Farming Guidelines, would crop the algae mat to near nothing within 4 to 6 weeks. Clean ditch meant free-flowing water. Free-flowing water on 80 acres of grain sorghum was the difference between 65% and 95% of the crop receiving adequate irrigation during April's critical establishment period. That was the first thing the fish would do. The second thing was slower and more important. Fish excrete ammonia into the water around them. Bacteria in any ditch water convert that ammonia to nitrites, and the nitrites to nitrates. Nitrates are plant-available nitrogen. Every irrigation event from a ditch that had been running tilapia for 8 weeks was a dilute liquid nitrogen application across the full field. Dario estimated the contribution at roughly 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre-foot of water delivered, which, on his irrigation schedule, worked out to somewhere between 60 and 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre across the season. Grain sorghum in Hidalgo County required 120 to 160 pounds of nitrogen per acre for optimum yield. He planned to apply 60 pounds of commercial fertilizer and rely on the ditch water to carry the balance. At current urea prices, $2.38 per pound of actual nitrogen that spring, the fertilizer he was not going to buy came to roughly $143 per acre. On 80 acres, that was $11,440. The invasive species problem he had solved in February, before he spent $1 on fish. At each of the 3 downstream outflow structures, he installed fine mesh stainless steel screens fixed to the concrete with threaded rod anchors. Mesh opening, 2 millimeters. No tilapia, juvenile or adult, passes through a 2 millimeter opening. He had the screens fabricated at a metal shop in Edinburgh for a total of $340. He showed the design to Pete Cisneros, who examined the anchors and the mesh gauge and took photographs, and said he could not find anything wrong with the installation. Cisneros told Hale. Hale said he would need to see how it played out. June came. The fish did not die. Gene Kuttner ran his irrigation checks on the brush line lateral twice a week through the growing season, The same as always. The same schedule his father had kept. He could not help noticing that the Escobar lateral was running cleaner than he had seen it in years. The water moved with less drag at the gate. The algae mat was gone by the last week of May, stripped down to the bare ditch wall. By mid-June, the earthen bottom was visible through the water column where the summer before it had been buried under a green mat 6 inches thick. He didn't say anything to Dario about it. Gene Kuttner did not speak until he was ready. He watched. He kept driving past the field. He watched some more. At 62 days after planting, Dario walked every row of the grain sorghum and counted plant populations. Stand was at 96% of targeted population, the best he and his father had seen on that ground. The crop color was a deep blue-green he associated with good available nitrogen. He submitted a soil sample to the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Lab in Weslaco, and the root zone nitrate results came back running 22% above what the full commercial fertilizer program had produced on the same ground the previous season. 22%. Same irrigation water, same seed, Pioneer 84G62, a standard commercial hybrid, nothing experimental, different ditch. Robert Hale drove out in late June without being called. He walked 2 rows. He came back to the road and stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the field from the road shoulder, which Gene Kuttner watched from his truck from across the road without comment. Hale asked to see the notebook. Dario gave him a photocopy. He kept the original. Hale returned 10 days later with a question about the threaded rod anchors in the outflow screens, whether the rod was stainless steel or galvanized, and what the pull-out rating from the concrete was. He said he wanted it documented for a potential district-level inquiry. He did not say the fish were working. He did not say they were not. He wrote down the answer and drove back to Mission. Gene Kuttner, sitting in his truck in the road, as he often was that summer, said to no one in particular after Hale's taillights had rounded the bend, "Something's working over there." It was, more than Gene had guessed yet. The grain sorghum on the Escobar lease was harvested in the second week of September 2019, cut with a neighbor's John Deere 9872 STS combine that Eugenio had arranged at custom rate. Dario rode in the cab for the first 2 rounds and then got out and watched from the turn row. When the final loads were weighed at the elevator and the average was calculated across the full 80 acres, the number that came back was 5,240 pounds per acre. The Hidalgo County average that year, per the USDA NASS report out of Austin, was 3,680 pounds per acre. The previous verified field-scale record for grain sorghum yield in the county, not a research plot, not a demonstration strip, but a commercial farm planting of real acreage, was 4,290 pounds per acre. Set in 1994 by a large operation near McAllen, using precision drip irrigation and intensive commercial fertility management. The Escobar family's 80 acres, watered by a ditch full of tilapia, beat that record by 350 pounds. Dario had spent $108 on fingerlings, 600 of them at $0, 18 each from an aquaculture supplier in the lower valley. He had spent $340 on the stainless screens. The rest of his input costs were within normal range for any Hidalgo County sorghum operation that season, except for the fertilizer line, which was $11,440 lower than a conventional program would have run. At the end of September, he netted the lateral and pulled the fish. 380 pounds of tilapia, averaging just under 1 pound each, consistent with 5 months of growth in warm water with abundant algae. He sold them to a live fish buyer in McAllen at $1. 40 per pound. That came out to $532. He sold $532 worth of fish out of a ditch that had been algae-choked and mosquito-clouded when the season started. His crops broke the county record, Robert Hale called the Escobar family in October and asked if Dario would be willing to present his method at the Hidalgo County Agricultural Forum in January of 2020. Dario said he would need to think about it. He thought about it for 2 days. He said yes. He stood at the front of a room with 140 farmers, extension staff, and irrigation district personnel, and walked through the notebook page by page in the manner of a young man who is not comfortable being the center of attention, but has something worth saying and intends to say it right. He told the room he was not a researcher. He made no claims beyond 1 season on 80 acres. He said his grandfather had done a version of this in Veracruz for 40 years, and that his grandfather had called it letting the water work twice. He is 22 now. He and his father lease 160 acres on the same road, and every lateral they control runs tilapia from April through September. His fertilizer costs run to roughly 40% of what comparable neighboring operations spend. 3 other farming families in the county have adopted versions of the method. In 2022, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension published a field research summary citing the Brush Line Road operation as a case study in integrated aquaculture crop production in semi-arid irrigated agriculture. He still has the notebook. He started a second one in January of 2020, the night after the forum, sitting at the kitchen table. He wrote the date at the top of the first page and then wrote his grandfather's name underneath it. Below that, he wrote, in his grandfather's phrasing, the one he had heard standing in knee-deep water between corn rows, letting the water work twice. He told someone later that he wasn't sure why he wrote it down. He just felt like it needed to be in the book. Gene Kuttner ran into a sorghum farmer named Cal Dewald at the service station in Mission one morning in March of 2020. And Dewald asked him about the Escobar boy and what exactly had been going on over there with the fish. Gene thought about it for a moment. He said the boy had learned something from his grandfather that nobody else in the county had thought to apply, and he had been patient enough to test it properly and careful enough not to claim anything before the numbers were in. Dewald said that sounded pretty simple. Gene said most of the best farming he had ever seen was. Abundio Escobar farmed the wet lowlands of Veracruz for 4 decades, and no one from a university ever came to document what he was doing or write it down. His grandson stood in a South Texas ditch with a bucket and a notebook, and the whole county came to look at what the old man had known. Some things travel slow. They arrive right on time.